Hello, my name is Matthew Lawrence. I am the co-editor-in-chief of the Hastings Race and Poverty Law Journal. We have with us today Nicole Alanko. She is one of the authors that published in our most recent edition, Volume 16, Edition 1. And we wanted to ask her a little bit more about her paper and to let the public have a more maybe accessible way to get to the ideas that she's promoting. So I'd like to welcome you.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Um, so I guess just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what got you into this particular field, what got you into the law, any other things you want to mention.
Sure. So I'll give a little bit of my academic background first. I did my undergraduate degree in international affairs at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And I chose to go to law school at William & Mary because of William & Mary's idea of the citizen lawyer, essentially saying that not only do we go into law and the practice of law, but we go into that to be the best citizens that we can and to be able to help advance justice in society more broadly. And so that's really what drew me to William & Mary. And from there, I knew that I wanted to go to law school and pursue a career in law because of that idea of the best way to generate social change and saying that we can make very tangible differences in the lives of people through law and legal advocacy, but also then policy advocacy. So yeah, I'll just kind of start with that and we can move on from there.
Cool, yeah, and I think those are the types of people that are typically, you're the type of person that is typically drawn to the Race and Poverty Law Journal, because we try to promote those same things, that being a lawyer has a lot of responsibility tied to it, not just to have a career and make money, but there's actually a very sort of inherent public service aspect to being an attorney. So that's great to hear. And I guess let's just get right into your article, and if you could just lay out what it is you're arguing. We could start with the title,
Yes.
which is I think a very helpful title. When I'm writing titles to papers, I'm always I want the reader to know what they're getting into beforehand, and I think yours really does a good job of that. So if you could just explain a little bit about what led you to that title and then your argument and things like that.
Sure. So my article is called Helpfulness is a Two-Way Street, How the Commonwealth of Virginia Can Support Undocumented Survivors of Violence. And the idea essentially behind my article is that the U visa that Congress created, and I'll go into more of the mechanics of the U visa in a little bit, but the U visa that Congress created puts this requirement on survivors of violence to be cooperative and help law enforcement or prosecutors with the investigation or prosecution of the crime. And essentially saying that survivors overcome so many different intersecting barriers when reporting domestic violence to law enforcement that the Commonwealth of Virginia and states in general, I used Virginia as an example, but this can be applied much more broadly to other states, should extend a hand to survivors, recognizing what they have overcome just to be in, to go to the police station, go to a social services agency, to go to legal aid, to go to an attorney and say, okay, here's what we can do to also help you reach, stability through immigration status.
Well, and what specifically are some of those barriers?
Sure. So a lot of the barriers that I discuss in my paper that immigrant and especially undocumented immigrant survivors of violence face, a lot of the barriers, like I say, they're intersecting barriers. So we're talking about barriers that are not only created by the dynamics of domestic violence, but we're also talking about barriers that have to do with race, that we're talking about religion, that we're talking about LGBTQ. We're talking about all different kinds of barriers that people face on top of the fact that somebody may be undocumented. So some of those barriers can be that an abusive partner uses tactics like isolation or economic dependence on someone. And those are exacerbated if you're undocumented because you may not speak the language where you are. Maybe you're living in a rural area. The economic dependence is worse if you don't have work authorization, or you're nervous to go work without authorization because you're worried about an employer taking advantage of you. But other barriers could be a fear of coming out. There are a lot of LGBTQ people who may be nervous about going to law enforcement or a domestic violence shelter because as soon as they have to go to, say, a mandatory counseling session at a shelter, they then have to come out and be repeatedly coming out and talking about that experience. And that may not be something that someone wants to do. And on top of all of this, you also have fears of being deported for someone who's undocumented. And so this can not only be a generalized fear of law enforcement and their ties to ICE, but now that's becoming even more of a reality when we talk about ICE arrests in and around courthouses. They've skyrocketed under this administration. And so the fact that ICE is in courthouses and is arresting people when they're going to get protective orders, they're going to get custody of their children, when they're going to New York's human trafficking intervention courts, these arrests are silencing survivors of violence who say, you know what, the risk of violence from my partner versus the risk of being deported, and they have to make that choice. A lot of people are choosing to say, I just don't want to get deported.
Right. And I think that's a really interesting point because it shows that there's this tension in the justice system to where we have channels in place for people to get help when they're facing domestic violence situation, but at the same time, the broader system has channels in place that can just ensnare those people. And I think particularly in today's reality, that's a very scary perspective for a lot of people to be facing. Yeah. And so I guess could you go into a little bit more detail about what it is that you think the state of Virginia should do, and what particularly do you think the legal reforms there should be, and how would they help alleviate the problem that you just described?
Sure. So the proposal that I have in my article is pretty small compared to all the different things that could be happening. There are both federal, across the country, there are both federal and state initiatives to do things like getting ICE out of courthouses, expanding language access, and things like that. So my article isn't talking about those suggestions specifically, even though those would be wonderful. My article is really focusing on this niche issue of U visa law enforcement certifications. So I'll back up and explain what a U visa is, and then because that'll help us understand the reforms that I want for Virginia. So the U visa was created in 2000 by Congress as a way to say, okay, we have immigration protections for survivors of violence who are married to a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, but there doesn't exist a protection for somebody who, say, is not married or who is married to somebody who is not a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. So the U visa is not just applying to domestic violence, it applies to several other crimes as well. But it essentially says, okay, if you're a victim of a crime and you have suffered harm from this crime, and you are helpful, are likely to be helpful, or have been helpful in the investigation or prosecution of this crime, you can apply for U visa non-immigrant status, which then gives a path to a green card and thereby a path to citizenship. The catch to this is that the way that you prove whether or not someone has been helpful is through a law enforcement certification. It's Form I-918 Supplement B. And this form is something that is signed by a certifying agency. So this can be Child Protective Services agencies, this can be a prosecutor, this can be a family court judge, this can be the police department. Signed by them saying this person has been helpful, here's the crimes that we investigated or prosecuted, here's how they were helpful, and sent with the application. The problem is that law enforcement agencies are not required to sign this. So, for example, a survivor can go through the entire process, can even testify. It's not required that they testify, but imagine that extent of being helpful to the prosecution and investigation of a crime. And then the prosecutor's office, the police department can say, sorry, we don't feel like signing this. And they can just simply refuse to sign it. And so sometimes they may refuse to sign these forms because they don't know what a U visa is. A lot of people have the misconception that when they sign this form, they're giving somebody immigration status, and that's simply not true. Some people might not sign it because they say, we don't think this person was helpful enough, which there's no real definition of what that is. And then finally, they might not sign it because they would say that it's not a qualifying crime. And so that's where an attorney comes in and says, no, we think that this is a qualifying crime, or this is substantially similar because da da da. My policy essentially would say that Virginia would have a presumption that a survivor is helpful. So it takes out that wiggle room of, deciding whether or not somebody was helpful. And the reason for doing that is because we want to recognize how much survivors have overcome just to be in the room, just to talk to law enforcement, just to talk to Child Protective Services, to be working with a prosecutor, and to recognize that, sometimes people's conceptions of helpfulness are rooted in ideas and stereotypes around race, around class, around gender, and they'll have these expectations laid out. So by kind of taking out that bit of discretion and saying that somebody is presumed to be helpful, it's a good start, at least, to saying that more U visa certifications will be signed by law enforcement agencies in Virginia, so that no matter where a survivor lives in Virginia, they can then start pursuing that form of stability.
Yeah, that it sounds like a pretty reasonable presumption for somebody who's literally coming forward to give the police information. It seems like that's inherently helpful. So, in what cases under your model would a law enforcement agency be able to say, well, the presumption has been overcome, and now we're still saying that this person has not been helpful? And are there circumstances that there would still be a chance for like a local sheriff's office to just say, we're not going to grant this person, or we're not going to sign off on the required document?
So I haven't spelled it out specifically here, partially because a lot of the what I wrote and what I was proposing is kind of modeled off of what California passed a few years ago. And so California also doesn't actually lay this out in any specific detail of when the presumption is overcome. But I think if this were then to be offered in front of the General Assembly and drafted up as a piece of legislation, that would be fleshed out a little bit more. So I don't want to speak to exactly how that would go, just because this is more of a broad theoretical proposal rather than here's what I would hand to the legislature tomorrow.
Right. Good. Okay. So getting into the specifics about the scope of law review articles in general, and then specifically your article, it's a broad idea that's sort of can be applied in I think various states, but at the same time, you sort of have, to borrow a phrase from the Supreme Court, narrowly tailored your article to address a very specific, not just legal issue, but also a very specific locality. And so I guess I wanted to ask, what is the broader vision that sort of maybe informs, but also that you would like to see reform in the federal system in this area, that could, maybe give maybe statutory federally, or even if there's any broader, like maybe constitutional principles that you would like to see enforced around this issue?
So I'll actually start with an even broader vision, just because this is the vision that really underlies my article and also my work as an attorney, is envisioning a world where the rights of survivors and access to justice for survivors of violence, regardless of their identity, including their immigration status, where those rights and that access to justice is upheld. That is the broader vision and broader idea behind my work and behind this paper. And so, like you said, this paper and this proposal is one very narrow way to get there. And I think, we all hope for comprehensive immigration reform. We all hope that those kinds of things are going to happen. But given the state of national politics right now, I think it's a little doubtful to see that very soon. But there are three other major policies that I think could really get us closer to that vision. So the three things are getting ICE out of courthouses, making sure that survivors aren't silenced when they want to seek justice in courthouses. Also language access, both in courthouses, but in social service providers and in legal service providers. And so making sure that when a survivor goes to the courthouse or goes to a legal aid office or goes to a domestic violence shelter, they are able to communicate with somebody there. So that can be language line interpreters, that can be someone on staff who speaks their language, but making sure that that kind of support is available, because it's not available in all parts of the country, especially in rural areas. And that can really hamper somebody's access to justice. That would also require, when we're talking about legal service providers, that attorneys become more culturally competent, that attorneys speak more languages, and making sure that we kind of have those changes in the legal profession and legal culture as a whole. And finally, the third thing is just increasing access to quality legal counsel for immigrants. So I'm an Immigrant Justice Corps fellow, which means that I'm part of one of the country's first fellowship programs that's trying to meet the need for quality legal representation for vulnerable immigrants. And so this model, we're focused a lot in New York right now, but we have fellows who are going to California, who are in Florida, who are in Texas, New Jersey. And so having models like that not only expand, but replicated across the country so that people have access to counsel and can speak to an attorney who can not only help with their immigration status, but also attorneys who understand the immigration implications of other things that they may be doing as well and other remedies that they may be seeking. So those are really kind of the three big policy changes that I would like to see happen. I know it doesn't necessarily implicate, constitutional rights like you're saying and things like that, but I think those are things that we could really see happen in the next, I'd say, 5 years that would greatly increase, the chances of getting to that much broader vision where the rights of survivors overall are upheld and they have better access to justice.
Yeah, I think that I think those all three sound like really good ideas, and I guess I would just like to sort of hone in on the third point and ask a follow-up question to say how much of the lack of representation and general quality legal access do you think is hampered by the fact that, for instance, states like California have I think it's like a 45% bar passage rate, and the statistics show consistently that the 10% of people, for instance, that would have passed the bar in New York, or maybe 30% of people that would have passed the bar in a place like Mississippi, they fail in California, and in that group of people is a very large percentage of people of color, first generation Americans, people that, maybe their language skills, not language skills, but their English language skills aren't as good as other people, and how this sort of systemic reality is a bar to increasing the number of people that are interested in this issue that are able to practice law.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, I can't necessarily speak to California's bar passage and the nuances of bar exams and things, because that is not my area of expertise. But it's definitely an issue. I mean, we have people who want to do this kind of work, not passing the bar, obviously, like you're saying, hampers the ability to have attorneys in these areas who speak these languages, working with clients. But, the other thing that we have to talk about that hampers us as well is student debt. It's really hard to take a public interest job, to live in an urban or rural area, depending on the cost of living, and to take a public interest job at a public interest salary when you have thousands of dollars of student debt. So, student debt is also implicated in access to legal representation. I mean, and, the issue of access to legal representation, I'm talking about it in the context of immigration because, that's what I do. But there are, I can use Georgia as an example. There are at least 6 or 7 counties in Georgia where there are no attorneys, none whatsoever. And this is replicated also across the Midwest. I mean, so this is a much larger problem than just maybe one state or another. And that hampers everyone, citizens and non-citizens, ability alike to seek access to justice, whether that's for housing issues, whether that is for domestic violence, child protective services, you name it. we have a problem of there are people in this country, vulnerable people, citizens and non-citizens, who need access to counsel who can't necessarily get it. And so we have like all these other we have so many systemic barriers that make that, you know, we need to really break through those barriers to be able to increase access to counsel. So, you know, like I said, I talk about it in the immigration context, and fellowship programs like mine help increase that access to counsel for immigrants. But, you know, programs like Equal Justice Works and others who are increasing access to counsel in other areas are just as valuable.
Right. And I think that's something that I hear a lot from something I hear a lot from people that I'm about to graduate with, you know, that are very talented attorney. They're going to be very talented attorneys, and they have a lot of student loan debt. And so, you know, the idea is, well, I'll take a job at this big firm for 5 years and then get everything under control, and then I'll be able to go out in the world and do what I want. And I think sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't. But just the sort of initial availability of young, sort of passionate people that are wanting to make a change, I think it definitely restricts that, because it's tough for a nonprofit that's going to pay someone, you know, half of the average salary to compete with a big corporate law firm. And, you know, we're talking about access to justice. Well, you know, Amazon doesn't have a hard time hiring more attorneys. It's always the people that don't have access already that have a hard time. So it's I think it's a very class-based, not just class-based in all the lines on which class are drawn in this country, but also just this sort of obsession with costs, and corporations will throw as much money as they have at a problem just to sort of increase transaction costs, to then make sure that they're not actually having to go to court and things like that, and have whatever they're doing exposed. And I guess that leads into the next question. What, in a cost obsessed society, what would the cost be of implementing the idea in your article? And I guess on the same token, you can speak to what would the cost be of not implementing it, which you've already touched on. But would there be, for instance, would there be budgetary concerns? Would there be any other external costs that we haven't thought of? And how do you balance those against the benefits?
Sure. So I think, you know, like I said, this is more of a theoretical proposal. So, you know, really being able to calculate out the costs of it is difficult. I think it would have to be drafted as a bill and then go in front of the General Assembly to be able to get a real nuts and bolts calculation. But I think what's really important to talk about is the cost of not implementing this policy. And this is really rooted in the idea of when we don't take domestic violence seriously and when we silence survivors. You know, when you look at almost every single mass shooting, I pointed this out to my partner recently, that every single mass shooting that we see, read in the article, they have a history of domestic violence, that somebody had tried to get a protective order, some history of domestic violence that then led to this. And, you know, when domestic violence isn't taken seriously, it affects everyone. It doesn't just affect that family. I mean, it needs to matter to society that it affects that person and that partner and that survivor and their family. But it affects all of us when we don't take it seriously. It is a threat to public safety when we don't take domestic violence and gender-based violence and family violence seriously. And so, you know, everybody talks a lot about in immigration about, oh, we think this will increase public safety, such as, you know, more ICE arrests and things like that. But increasing those ICE arrests at courthouses and other places is a much larger threat to public safety, because now you don't have survivors of violence coming forward because they're terrified of being deported, or they're terrified of their abusive partners being deported. You know, there's a lot of survivors who will say, I just want the abuse to stop. I want to get away from a relationship. I want to rebuild my life. But they don't necessarily want their partner deported. They don't want to go that far. And so when we don't implement policies like this, when we're keeping survivors from accessing justice, from getting the stability that they need, it's a much, much greater risk to public safety. So I think that's really, when it comes down to being proposed in the Virginia legislature, we start getting the nuts and bolts calculations of how much will it cost to keep data on U visa certifications, how much will it cost to be signing these papers and things like that. We need to weigh that against the fact that we need to take domestic violence seriously for the safety of families and partners, but for the safety of all of us.
Right, and I really like that you've taken the discussion there, because domestic violence doesn't only affect necessarily the person who may go report to the police. It also is affecting the children that are involved in this, that who rarely have the ability to go, and so it's often the abused partner that is sort of then has responsibility, and if they're not able to go because they're afraid they themselves will be detained or otherwise harmed by the system itself, then that makes it even more difficult because, and as far as the public safety angle goes, I think that it also bleeds into that, to where not only do a lot of the shooters that these mass shooters that we see, not only do they themselves have a history of being violent towards other people, particularly people that they're close to, but they have almost always been abused in their past as children. And so it just seems like this is a cycle of abuse and neglect that perpetuates violence. And until society's ready to really deal with it in ways that are going to eliminate it and significantly reduce it, then we're going to continue to see these problems. And I think it's also great that you point out that the sort of the things that people point to that say, oh, well, this is going to make us safer. If we put up a wall, if we let ICE do whatever they want, essentially, well, let's send the National Guard down to the border. These things actually, many groups that are involved in, for instance, the sex trafficking along the border, the drug trafficking, many people that are involved in trying to get that under control completely disagree that any of these methods are actually going to increase public safety. It's just going to, in the same way that domestic violence survivors are going to be sort of driven into the shadows, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to simply make it more difficult to help alleviate these problems. So, yeah, I think it's really great that you go there. And so I guess I just have one more question and then we'll have some closing remarks. But in regards to law enforcement and building trust, first off, what do you think can be done, I guess, on maybe a broader level for people to trust law enforcement more? I mean, I'm clearly a person that has a lot of privilege, but I have had run-ins with police officers in the past that I look back on now, and that those police officers were acting completely illegally, and it makes me not trust police officers at all. And I can't imagine what it's like to be a person from a marginalized community who's facing those same issues. So I guess how can we build trust with law enforcement? And I mean, that's a tough question, but maybe you have some insight on it.
So it's hard to say because, like you said, it's a tough question. I also think it's a much more localized question than we realize. And I'm in my paper, I'm writing about Virginia, and so I can kind of speak a little bit to some of the nuances and localized nuances in Virginia. But regions of Virginia and even different counties within those regions are all very different. And so I think law enforcement needs to be responsive to their communities. I think I want one broad overarching, recommendation, if it isn't already in different police departments, is language access. I think just being able to communicate with an officer and an officer understand, an officer not relying on, okay, who in the house speaks English? Okay, I'll talk to that person, because that in many instances may be the abusive partner. And so, making sure that language access and things like that are an option. But I think really listening to local communities and local communities having conversations with law enforcement about here is what we need, here is what we're trying to accomplish here, because the solutions that Augusta County and Rockingham County in Western Virginia, the solutions that they would propose that would make most sense in their counties are going to be very different from what the city of Norfolk or Fairfax County will have to offer and will need to do to be responsive to the people living in their community. So I think that's what's most important, is to be responsive to that. But like I said, one broad overarching suggestion, if it isn't implemented already, is language access, but listening to what people have to say in the area.
Great. So I think we're about near the end, and I just wanted to give you a chance to make any closing remarks. Maybe if you have, I don't know, people really like to hear views that that smart, driven people like yourself may have on politics or something like that. But if you have anything that you'd like to say, here's your chance.
Sure. So I'll just kind of wrap up and give a little bit of a summary of what we've talked about and just kind of reinforce why this is important as well. Like I said, I and so many of my colleagues as well, we strive for a world that respects the rights of survivors of violence and that upholds their access to justice and whatever that may mean for them. Survivors are going to make a decision about what works for them in their given situation. And survivors who come to my office, immigrant survivors of violence who come to my office, have overcome so many barriers to be there. They've overcome, the tactics of abuse that they have had to face. They've overcome language access barriers. They've overcome fears of ICE. They've overcome, systemic racism that's latent in the justice system. They've overcome all of these things to be there in my office. And so in this article, the policy that I've proposed is really saying that states need to extend a hand to survivors, saying, we recognize what you've been through. We recognize everything that's been going on with you, and we want to help you seek out this stability. And this policy is not a Republican or a Democrat policy. It's not a conservative or liberal policy. This is a policy saying, you are a survivor of violence. You have been through something that should not happen, and we want to help make it better for you. We want you to be able to support yourself, support your family, and to make a better life for yourself here in the United States. And so that's why I've proposed this. That's why I think this policy is something that can not only be implemented in Virginia, but can be implemented across the country, and that different states can really bring this out and use this as a way to start building trust. And like I said at the beginning, the policy that I've proposed, I know is very small, very niche, but I believe that it's part of this larger vision of respecting and upholding the rights of survivors and their access to justice. And we can't forget the voices of survivors in this. So hopefully, as policies like this go forward and as these are introduced in state legislatures, I hope that stakeholders, shelters, and survivors themselves will be able to speak up and be part of implementing these policies, because we want to make sure that this is responsive to on-the-ground needs and to what people are experiencing in their communities. So that's my hope for this policy. That's my hope for the work that we do. And so I remain hopeful. It's not perfect. It's a hard times we're in right now, but I remain hopeful for myself and my clients.
Well, it was really great to talk to you, and I hope that we can get this out and that people will be able to access it. And I feel like the interview has been very candid, and I appreciate your time. And thank you so much for the work that you're doing. There's so many people out there that need help, the type of help that you're giving, and we just can't thank you enough. And thank you for selecting our journal to publish in. We think that your piece was outstanding, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm really thankful for you guys too, publishing it. Glad to get this out, and hope this sparks more conversation.
Absolutely. All right. Well, enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.